Hey everyone! Today we'll be discussing spinal cord anatomy and spinal pathways. I'm going to switch over to full screen as we continue the talk. So let's get started. So let's go through some basic anatomy of the spinal cord. Now the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system together with the brain and brain stem. It's connected to the brain stem around this area, and it links the brain to the rest of the body. It's protected by the vertebral canal, and as you can see on the picture we have here, it's divided into different regions, and each region has spinal nerves. Now the spinal nerves of each region comes in pairs at each level. So when we talk about spinal nerves, there's a spinal nerve for the left side and the right side of the body. So we have the cervical area of the spinal cord with 8 pairs of spinal nerves, the thoracic area with 12 pairs of spinal nerves, the lumbar area with 5 pairs, the sacral area with 5 pairs, and the coccygeal area with 1 pair of spinal nerves. So altogether, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves in the peripheral nervous system, and they are a link from the periphery of our body to the brain. Now there are 2 other parts of the spinal cord that I'd like to point out to you. The first is this tapered end of the spinal cord called the conus medullaris, and is found around L1 to L2. The second is a bunch of nerve fibers that is at the bottom of the spinal cord. This is called the cauda equina, and it consists of spinal nerves from L2 to L5, the sacral spinal nerve, and the coccygeal spinal nerves. And these are important, as we will discuss later on. So why are these spinal nerves important? Now they are part of, as I said before, the peripheral nervous system, and they innervate certain parts of the skin. And this map of the skin, called dermatomes, or they map the locations on the skin that is innervated by the different spinal cords. And this is important because in a clinical setting, if there's a spinal cord injury, it helps in determining at what level the injury is located. And we will see how this plays a part later on in the talk today. Now, if we were to cut the spinal cord and have a look at the cross section, this is what we will find. Now, in the different regions of the spinal cord, there are slightly different shapes. The cervical, as you can see here, is a bit elongated. The thoracic is more rounded, and in the lumbar region, there's a larger butterfly-shaped area in the middle, which, as we will discuss in the next slide, is the gray matter. Now, the general anatomy of a cross-section of the spinal cord is shown here. So the spinal cord is divided incompletely by these 2 areas. Now this part of the spinal cord is the ventral or the anterior part, and this is the posterior or the dorsal part. In the anterior part, we have this anterior median fissure or the ventral median fissure, and the posterior, we have the posterior or dorsal median sulcus. This butterfly-shaped or H-shaped area in the middle is called gray matter, and the white area around or surrounding the gray matter is called white matter. The gray matter tends to have the cell bodies, axon terminals, and dendrites, and the white matter contains myelinated axons and their support cells. Now in the middle of the spinal cord, as you can see here, there's a bit of a hole. That is the central canal, and that contains cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that flows around the central nervous system. Additionally, we have these nerves that coming out or protruding from the spinal cord. To the dorsal end, we have the dorsal root, and the ventral part, we have the ventral root, and they both unite laterally to form the spinal nerve. Now, the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve because the dorsal root carries sensory information and the ventral root carries motor information, and so the spinal nerve is a mix of sensory and motor, and we will discuss this further. Another thing that I wanted to point out in the spinal cord before I continue is this crisscross area in the middle. I have it marked in red. This is called the anterior wide commissure. And this is where we have fibers crossing over from one side of the spinal cord to the other. And we say they're decussating in this anterior wide commissure. And we'll discuss this more as we continue. So we've done the cross-section of the spinal cord. We've done some gross anatomy of the spinal cord. What is the spinal cord covered in? Well, it's covered in the meninges, which is the covering of the brain. And just as in the brain, the meninges is made up of the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. Here it's in red, surrounding the spinal cord. Then we have the middle layer, the arachnoid mater, in pink. And the outermost tough layer is the dura mater, in green. The other two important things that I wanted to point out to you are two spaces which we find very relevant in clinical medicine. Now, the subarachnoid space is this space here between the arachnoid and the pia mater, and this is important because this is the area that has cerebrospinal fluid and where lumbar puncture is performed. The second is the subdural space, which is the area between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and this is where epidurals are given. So these are important clinically. Now, as we discussed, the spinal cord is the link between the periphery of the body and the brain. So we have nerves that run up and down the spinal cord that facilitate communication between the brain and the body. Now we have tracts that ascend. So they carry information like pain and temperature, touch, from the body to the brain, and these are called sensory tracts. So the ascending tracts are sensory tracts. The tracts that bring information from the brain are motor tracts, and they are descending tracts. So these are important, and we'll discuss this further. So for the ascending tracts, we're looking at the blue colors here. There are three main ascending tracts that we will discuss: the dorsal wide column, the spinal cerebellar tracts, and the spinal thalamic tracts. Now, this is where they are located in the spinal cord. Now, if you look at it, this is a mirror image, left and right. So whatever we find on the left side, we also find on the right side. Now, what are the functions of these columns? So the dorsal column, sometimes known as the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, is made up of the gracile and the cuneate fasciculi. And the fasciculi is a bundle of nerves, and they're responsible for fine touch, proprioception, which is joint position, and vibration. The spinothalamic tract, made up of the lateral tract, which is important for pain and temperature sensation, and the anterior spinothalamic tract, which is important in crude touch and pressure. And thirdly, the spinocerebellar tract, which is made up of the anterior and posterior tract, and they are responsible for proprioception. So in the sensory pathways, chains of neurons are important in the formation of these tracts. So we have three orders of neurons. We have the first, second, and third order neuron. And to discuss this, I'll use the dorsal column or the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway to explain first, second, and third order neurons. So the first order neuron receives innervation, or they receive the message like vibration or proprioception or touch from the periphery of the body, and the nerve passes through the dorsal root of the spinal cord. Now remember, we had a dorsal root and we had a ventral root, not shown here. The dorsal root carries the sensory pathway. The cell body of the dorsal root ganglion, which I didn't point out earlier, but this is a cell body, it's a swollen area. This is the dorsal root ganglion, is a swollen area that contains the cell bodies of these nerves. So the first order goes through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve and ascends through the dorsal column to the medulla. The second order neuron, the axon decussate. Now we were talking about in the spinal cord, the anterior wide commissure. In the dorsal column, the axons decussate in the medulla oblongata. So it means they cross over from one side of the body to the next side of the body, and it ascends to the thalamus. The third order neuron, then projects axons from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. Now again, I just wanted to point out, if you remember, the dorsal root is responsible for the sensory pathway. Now, the neurons decussate in different regions depending on the tract. As we discussed in the dorsal pathway, the neurons decussated in the medulla oblongata. This is an example of the spinothalamic pathway, where the neurons decussate actually in the spinal cord itself, in the anterior white commissure, as we discussed earlier. So this is important to remember, especially when a patient or someone presents with spinal cord damage, and we will discuss this in an example later on. Now, the descending tracts are a little bit different than the ascending tracts. Descending tracts are shown here in the red. And again, it's bilateral, so whatever you see on one side, you see on the same on the other side. And we have several descending tracts that we'll discuss. The descending tracts, there are two systems that receive motor commands. We have the somatic nervous system, and that's responsible for voluntary muscle control. So we're looking at skeletal muscle, where it's voluntary. We have the autonomic nervous system, that's responsible for involuntary control. For example, cardiac muscle or smooth muscle control, and also some glands. And the tracts are divided into a pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts, somatic and autonomic. So the pyramidal tracts, we have the corticospinal and the corticobulbar. Corticospinal, voluntary control of skeletal muscles, and corticobulbar, voluntary control of facial, including eye muscles. So again, these are the motor tracts, they're somatic. The extrapyramidal tracts are the involuntary tracts. We have the vestibulospinal tract, and if you look at the name, you can try to work out what it actually does. Vestibular, from the vestibular apparatus in the inner ear to the spinal cord. So this helps to maintain equilibrium from input from the vestibular apparatus, so that we have effects on muscle tone and axial muscles. The tectospinal tracts, they coordinate head and eye movements in response to visual and auditory stimuli. We have the reticulospinal tract, which is made up of lateral and medial tracts, and they are involved in locomotion and postural control. And then we have the rubrospinal tract, which is responsible for the control of muscle tone in our flexor muscle. So we've discussed the anatomy of the spinal cord and some spinal pathways. How does this translate to the real world? A patient presents with an injury to the spinal cord and is found that half of the spinal cord has been damaged. So we have a hemisection of the spinal cord. How does this then translate in a clinical setting? Now we have to look at the pathways that are affected, or the tracts that are affected, and the function of these tracts, and where these tracts decussate or cross over. So in this case, the person will present with loss of all sensation in the area or at the level of the injury. So in this case, it's around T6, T8 on the right side of the body. Now below the level of injury, what's affected? Now, the dorsal column, it decussates in the medulla oblongata. So these nerves will be ascending up the body and would not be able to continue. So we have impaired dorsal column function, which is proprioception, vibration, fine touch. However, when we look at the spinothalamic tract, which is responsible for pain and temperature, these nerve fibers decussate in the spinal cord, so they're able to cross over and descend to the medulla, so it's not affected on the side of the injury. However, on the contralateral side, pain and temperature and crude touch, which a spinal cord would be affected. So this, I hope, made some sense to you. I've just included a few books that I think are excellent and would be helpful, and I hope that you were able to gain some further understanding on today's topic.